The next section, the section on sacraments is led by Aisha Brooks Johnson, and she's the executive presbyter for Greater Atlanta. And this section is absolutely fabulous. I was a little unsure of how sacraments fit with evangelism when I first sat down, to tell you the truth, and how they work together. And she brought it home quite nicely. I really liked the way she talked about God, also God of grand invitation and wonder working God. I thought they were brilliant and very impactful for me, just as I read just those first opening words for the opening and closing prayer. She takes a really interesting approach to the sacrament, especially as it comes to the Lord's Supper, communion. She says, within our book of order, we are reminded that sacraments are both physical signs and spiritual gifts, including words and actions surrounded by prayer in the context of the church's common worship. They employ ordinary things, the basic elements of water, bread, and wine, in proclaiming the extraordinary love of God. She writes, I love that last line. Extraordinary things are employed to proclaim the extraordinary love of God. This language invites us to be fully present in the participation of the sacraments. And it is about a mindset of remembering that we are ordinary objects being used in extraordinary ways. And we're continued to do this, continually invited to do this. She writes that it's we're invited to be fully present, invited to be present in the mystery of the moment, of the ordinary that becomes extraordinary during the sacraments. And then as ascending, we get a chance to be sent out as changed disciples. And enter our days then has changed people through the sacraments. She talks about living sacramentally here, and that is just an amazing notion that she talks about. I encourage you to dive into that a little bit more. We don't have the time for that today, unfortunately. I think we could spend an entire day on each one of these sections. So yeah, they're just that rich to me. The habits, she says, that help. Go ahead.
Well, I just hope we will, because this little statement from a child keeps coming through my mind, a child that visited church who said, why do you have those little tiny pieces of bread? Can I have more than one? I think for a lot of people who are not raised in the church, the sacraments don't feel generous. They feel odd and strange. What Aisha wrote here is beautiful. And, when I intentionally dive deep into my worship experience, I do experience what she's writing about here. Mostly I appreciate it when I'm ripping a hunk off of a bigger piece of bread and dunking it, watching the wine get absorbed or the grape juice get absorbed. But I think I would really like somebody to talk about ways that our celebration of the sacrament can reflect what she's written here, because I think we expect a lot of people. And I find it interesting that a lot of the new congregations, they are joining around food. And I almost wonder if we don't need to go back to the Seder idea of communion.
Or the Eucharist meal. Yeah, the Eucharist meal, the Eucharist feast. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that is. Yeah. Yep. Good points. The food is definitely has become even more of a focal point than it was before. I think people are starting to realize how much we missed that during the pandemic.
Right.
Cordelia, I think that's just really profound to think about how we visually are expressing more of a scarcity than the abundance. The way we offer just the small pieces and the little cups, and I think that's great to
Favorite
ponder that a little bit.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is about a child who had been at a soccer practice, and she was hot and sweaty and was late coming to church and ran into the church, and they were serving communion, and she was like the last person, and she was like 8 or 9. She came running up to the chancel and was offered the cup and was so thirsty that she almost drained it. And, her mother was like horrified watching this, where her mother was sitting. And the pastor handled it just so beautifully and stepped out of the traditional liturgy and just said, drink, my child, drink and be satisfied. And it was a moment that was never forgotten by that congregation.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah.
Don't hold back. Drink and be satisfied.
So she defines living sacramentally as the practice, kind of like the practice of mindfulness and being intentional. And it takes an intentional approach to being living a life of prayer and living a life that looks through the eyes of Christ. And so she encourages using the habits of rest, reflect, rediscover, and resist. And the resist part is not, may not be what you think, but it's talking here. She says, resist the temptation to go through the motions of daily living. For many busy people in the world, we can skate by going through the motions of going to work, family, church, recreation. We get up, we get it done. We check in with others, we get a little more work done, we call it night, hit repeat for the next day. Resist the temptation to go through the motions. And then let's go. The next one is prayer, and that was led by Tom Bagley. He starts out with a quote from Barna research study that came out around 2020, I think, that a lot of people pray and have, but then he talks about how it's the prayer that most people encounter is not the prayer that the disciples may have used. It's an interesting way of looking at it, because he talks about how the lives of early followers of Jesus, there was something so uncommon and attractive about the way they prayed, it literally drew them to the community. Indeed, it was the early Christians' practice of prayer that empowered them and gave them buoyancy. It's because they believed that God would answer their prayers, which allowed them to then take risks, and believing that God would help them in times of struggle. And that was new. And that new way of engaging with God brought a lot of people to the community because they wanted to know what it was about and why are things so different with you guys? And, what's this about that God interacts with us? And it's not just a talking to the void kind of thing. He takes a little more of a structured approach to prayer when it comes to the habits. He talks about doing these things on a routine basis. So the routine, a routine of personal encounter with God through prayer. He encourages people to do that daily. A regular practice of praying with others, which he encourages weekly. Routine practice of prayer walking in your neighborhood, place of work or community, looking for the activity of God. And I skipped over one. A regular practice of expecting and identifying and naming prayers that have been answered. And that should be done whenever we pray. Oftentimes, we don't. I don't know about you, but I forget to go back and look at what we prayed for. And it was a church when I was serving as a bivocational pastor, I had to start writing down the prayers that were coming in from the pulpit, as we did as a part of worship, because it was a smaller congregation. And then I started looking back, referencing like, oh, 2 weeks ago we said this about your aunt. How is she doing? And so then it became something that we could walk with together and see where God was in the midst of that. I like the prayer walking idea as well, and that's he encourages people to do that once or twice a week, and then a practice of praying in person with neighbors, coworkers, family, and friends whenever someone, and he says to do this whenever someone expresses a deep felt concern, a joy, or a need. Oftentimes we're compelled to pray with somebody when they have a need, but forget about the joy. And that's good to lift up too. Some of his discussion questions all of his discussion questions are good. There are two parts. The idea of prayer influencing just people praying, influencing non-churchgoers. What is your response to the idea that a distinctive practice of prayer may in fact draw non-churchgoers to good news? I hadn't thought about the fact that my prayers just somebody witnessing my prayers could do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
If your prayers show deep compassion and a deep belief that you really are communicating with God, that you're not just doing something rote.
Yeah.
I think that's powerful. I think people sense it.
Sorry.
You hear a lot of young people that are not in the church say, I'm tired of that thoughts and prayer things. As a matter of fact, I think in a lot of young people, they're really reacting negatively and saying, I don't need your prayers. I don't want your prayers. I want action. And I think a lot of young people think that has just become a saying that we throw out there. So this is really beautiful. What you're talking about is the way that we actually demonstrate a prayer. What you just shared, remembering somebody's prayer, letting them know that you actually have been faithful in praying for them. I mean, that's caring. One of my favorite little sayings is, what you really need is a good listening to. Not a talk.
I like that. Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, I relate to that, Cordelia. It especially distressed me when there was so much gun violence, and especially around Parkland. And the students were saying, I'm tired of the prayers. And so I participated in a walk against gun violence, and my sign was, I prayed, God, please stop gun violence. And then God responded, and then, with actions. And so I wanted to bring out that my prayer is action, that it's not just, like you said, just a kind of a comment you throw out as a whatever, that actually, that I believe that prayer is a form of action.
Yeah, that's true. It's good to remember that it's not just a platitude that we lift up to make ourselves and others feel better. There's something behind it, and we fervently believe that.
Right.
We'll skip over that because we're on to justice now with Ralph Watkins. And justice was one of those topics that I thought, yeah, of course, that should be a part of it. But I had no idea how. Or what it should look like. And again, he just blew my mind with his words. Jesus made it perfectly clear that the needs of those who are on the margins were more important than the traditions of the day. Traditions are to be broken when it comes to meeting the needs of those in need. Jesus broke these traditions and fed the hungry. Whenever tradition got in the way of ministry that met the needs of the most vulnerable, Jesus challenged that tradition. Plucking the grain on a Sunday, on a Sabbath, and eating it was more important than the tradition of not working. And Ralph Watkins really talks about walking the walk and showing that love publicly, what love publicly looks like is justice. Yeah, it's rich and deep. He didn't just preach the gospel, he brought out good news in the world and deed. He didn't do it for the fact of just growing the crowds, but crowds gathered because he was around and because he was making a difference. Jesus did real ministry and made a real difference in the lives of people. And he was showing the disciples and the world that justice is what love looks like publicly. And I think back to what you were saying about prayer, Cordelia, and Cheryl, about how it requires that action, and that we are called to be the physical representation of Christ, not just the spiritual representation of Christ, but the physical representation of Christ. If our communities don't physically represent Christ with justice, with prayer in action, with radical welcome, with when somebody dies, supporting the grieving family, then we're not doing the work that we've been called to do, and it just becomes words. His habits: if you see something, say something, and if you say something, then do something. Those two definitely go together. I really like saying that's enough, or saying that's enough, doing, follow through. Science has figured out that, in the life of a child, if you want to disrupt the trauma that they have gone through, and you want to disrupt the struggles that they've had, offering real concrete support and help makes a difference. A caring adult makes a difference. So getting out there and doing something with that child makes a difference. It's not just saying, I'm going to pray for you, but following through on that. And he says, if there aren't enough seats at the table, go get a chair for someone who is not at the table.
I think there's also an important piece to all of this, is in creating conversation and building relationships. What I'm saying is, it's one thing to hand out a bottle of water, but it's also reaching out and making a conversation and just, trying to get to know that person. And oftentimes that person will share something with you. And then, as you may not have time, but what I'm saying is, I even had an experience up in the mountains where we asked somebody to take a picture of a friend of myself. And and we just started a bit of conversation just after the picture, and they found out that we were believers, and they asked us to pray for them about some things. And what I'm saying is, I think oftentimes we're afraid to just enter into another person's life, even if it's just briefly in a word of conversation or an invitation, or as you were saying, the young people don't really want us to say we're thinking and pray for them. They want us to be involved in their lives, and how can we do that, whether it's just a moment or other activities. But I think relationships in evangelism is extremely important.
Yes, it absolutely is. Absolutely. Yeah. And that is,
I think many
talked
times
about-
we're just afraid to be vulnerable, to be ourselves, because many people in our vulnerability realize that we're just as they are, and they can share with us and ask for a prayer. I've had that happen so often.
yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you bring up, where'd it go? There it is. Relationships, because in teaching, Todd Bolsoner, who wrote the book Canoeing Through the Mountains, came out just recently, talks a lot about relationships as part of teaching. First, he says, the Bible is like the Constitution, or it's like a musical score or a trail map. It's a performative document. And those documents are meant to get people to do something. And the Bible is one of those performative documents. It's to get people to do. It's for living. And he gives a good example of that in this, where he looks at Psalm 119. But I want to get to his habits, because this is what really made me think of it. Linnell, is that before you cook for people, eat with them. He talks about how he equates his teaching to the practice of teaching to the practice of cooking, and how you prepare for somebody, you teach them how to cook. I can't do it justice. I'm struggling to do it justice, but that it's a performative document. And anyway, so rather than just cooking for somebody and not knowing what they like, what they don't like, where they are, you got to sit down and you got to eat with them. You can't just come in and tell them what to do or tell them what to eat, or you have to have that
That's
relationship there
profound.
with them.
Yeah, that's profound.
Mhm.
Before you
Yeah.
cook for people, eat with them, and boy, get to know what kind of food they're used to, and
Yeah.
what tastes like home for them, what
Mhm.
feels like love for them.
Yeah. 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 Follow the
Let
recipes.
them bring their
number
food
two.
to the potluck.
Yeah.
Not necessarily literally, but
There you
learn to
go.
appreciate what they are and who they are.
Yeah.
Profound.
Yeah. Yeah. Follow the recipe, but apprentice with a great cook. So don't just think you can do it all by yourself. You got to have a mentor there with you. Let them taste your fingers. And that's an interesting concept from Korean cooking, where they believe the meals taste differently based on who cooks them, because of the taste, the experience on a person's finger, and where their life has taken them and all the different things that they have done. And so it's a belief that you should let people know about your experiences and let people know where you're coming from, and don't be afraid to share yourself with others. And then don't just pass on the recipe, a moralistic guide for people to follow. Cook with them, be with them, be in relationship with them, walk beside them, be there with them. So it really is about the relationships, and teaching is a way that we help to develop our evangelism, because it helps develop us as a disciple, helps us to grow, helps us to become deeper and richer in knowledge. And you'll like the next one, because the next one is fellowship. And I was really disappointed that Villa Marie was at and Jose Manuel and Villa Marie were at the Presbytery meeting yesterday, but they rushed by and said hi and bye, and I didn't get a chance to sit down and talk with them. I really wanted to talk with them about how I enjoyed their fellowship section, because they did a great article, essay, if you will, on fellowship. And they say the essential to forming a community is establishing and fostering authentic relationships. And in life, everything is about relationships, fostering authentic relationships. So yeah, the listening, like you were saying, and guiding, or, letting the conversation be your guide, and letting the other person share where they're coming from and what things look like from their perspective. That's huge. I had a continuing ed instructor that said that he believed that listening to somebody was a spiritual practice, because it allowed that person to connect spiritually.
So let's think about how rarely we do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we don't do it in worship at all. And, one of the things that is frustrating for me is how few people respond to trying to start small group ministries. People don't want to make time for that. It's hard enough getting them to make time for 1 hour of worship. But then, of course, we will make time for those people we know. We'll have some fellowship after worship with the people that we're most comfortable with, the people that we like the best, the people that we know the best. That's just human. But I mean,
Yeah.
when you have a visitor, they are either not noticed or welcomed into those conversations, or they choose not to stay because they don't, that maybe they don't find just cookies or donuts appealing, or, maybe nobody's actually spoken to them and made them feel noticed or something like that. Who knows? But I think, this is my personal opinion, that we really need to rethink worship in the Presbyterian Church, just so that we, all right, it's my opinion, I'm going to go ahead and share it. We need to pray in a way that gives people a sacred space in their Sunday morning. I think we need to pray in a way that attracts and draws people in, like you were just saying. And I think we have to find some way to encourage relationship building starting in worship. And I think on one of your slides, it was talking, maybe it was Aisha, about, making a place for different people in worship, so that we get to know more people through the worship experience than just our pastor, and see that there are different ways to pray, and then try to intentionally find ways for those people to be available after worship, so that maybe a quieter, more introverted person might actually come up and start talking to them. That's the beginning of a relationship. And then we have to find better ways to encourage people to be in relationship after worship, because, we somehow always make time for the things that are important to us, that we care about. We'll go out to dinner, or we'll go to the movie or something like that. But we have a hard time coming up with events at church that are outside of Sunday morning that people are willing to come back for.
Yeah. Or maybe even move it outside of the church. If they're not willing to come back for it, let's, maybe there's a off-site place that we could have a barbecue, or you could have a bonfire or whatever. But yeah, that's great. Yeah, they spend a lot of time talking about connecting with people. And
Tony, we've lost you for a second. You have frozen. Still didn't come back yet. At least not for me. How about the rest of you all?
No.
Nope.
While we're waiting, I'd like to hear from Michael about what he thinks as far as relation building in the church.
You want to pick on me? I don't know.
Yep.
So it's the be all and end all. Without relationships, you don't have anything. Lynette already knows this as part of our session. every member of session has to spend a time of togetherness with another member of session every month, so that by the end of the year, every elder will have met with every other elder outside of a meeting, to get to know one another.
I'm turning my chair over to Tony
Okay.
since he got bumped up again.
Say it again, please, Michael. Every elder is required to do what?
Every elder is required to meet with every other elder, and we do that once a month, so that by the end of the year, every elder will have sat with every other elder outside of a business meeting, outside of a session meeting, so that they
That
can.
hasn't been particularly easy because there seems to be a fear sometimes even among the elders, our
Mhm.
leadership, of reaching into another person's life and being vulnerable and just letting them get to know you. Right, Michael?
Yep. We do the same. We do the same with the deacons. So the leadership of the church all should in some way know one another better and deeper during those encounters. As a leadership team, we meet together, that's elders and deacons, once every 2 months, just to sit, not talk about session items, not talk about property. Let's not talk about stuff. What does it mean to be together? And tomorrow night, actually, we have our meal gathering, and so we're going to just spend 2 hours together breaking bread and without any other agenda. We'll have some. We always have icebreakers. We always have mechanisms to force the conversation if we need to. And so,
That's great.
That sense of relationship is paramount, and that's for me not just the leadership of the church, but that's everyone within the church. And so, other spaces that we can create where others can gather, that they can just talk and be with each other.
That's not always all business. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we when I was at one of the churches bivocationally, I would have to do session on Sundays, and session would always be right after worship, and then we'd always have to hustle to get to lunch. They'd want to cut things short, so we ended up having each committee would bring a lunch for us, and session would have lunch together and do session at the same time. And it was resisted for the first couple of months, first couple of times, and then it slowly they got into it and they started to like it a little bit more. I like that idea though of doing it outside, completely outside of worship or of the meeting. That is, or having that be the whole meeting. That's fantastic. That is fantastic. They have their habits for developing fellowship, or as they call it, koinonia, which is the Greek term for community and fellowship. So recognize the imago Dei, that is the image of God in all people that are encountered, and that we are all coming from a place of Christ, and a place of the same place. We're all there. I had a gentleman that came to speak to our football team when I was in high school, and I grew up in Oklahoma, so it was a more spiritual place than it should have been, maybe, or could have been. And so this guy was coming in, and he was a pastor, and the head football coach even left the next year to go be the head of FCA. But he came in and he was talking about his mission, and talking about his work with young adults in the inner city of Oklahoma City. And my coach gave him this amazing intro of all these accolades and stuff. And he said, I really could have just done with Child of God. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. Way to put us in our place. Their second habit for developing is cultivate the art of listening and paying attention. And that is right along with where we have been talking and what we've been talking about. And there are a number of good books on it, a number of good techniques, but really, are you slowing down? Are you being present? Are you intentionally listening to what the other person is saying, rather than thinking about what's coming next, or how you're going to respond, or what you have to do next, or those kind of things.
So a good teaching for that one is the Stephen Ministry Program.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
where they have a module for 3 hours on active listening, and there's role playing. And even if you took it outside of the Stephen ministry and just used it with deacons and elders, which we have done in the past,
Wonderful.
just to encourage that sense of you need to be engaged in what the other person's saying. And the role playing is pretty, it gets pretty basic. Repeat back to the person what they just said to you. I mean, it takes you down to that level.
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
think that should be an adult Sunday school class for the entire congregation.
Yeah.
I think that's the definition of Christian friendship, is to be able to listen that way. I think we're all called to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And their last habit then is to establish authentic relationships and work in concrete ways to connect with others. And you can tell they're both teachers because they're very grounded in action here. And they want to make sure that we're working, in concrete ways and stuff. When my son was born, my wife's a pastor and I was serving at the time. And we had a lot of people saying, we'll pray for you. We'll keep praying for you and let us know if you need anything. We had 2 people show up, and I still remember their names 11 years later. One showed up and said, here's a frozen lasagna, cook it at 400. And another person said, here's a gift card to Pizza Hut. And so those concrete ways of showing up and establishing that relationship help us to remain connected, even though neither my wife or I are connected to either of those churches anymore. And it's been 11 years, almost 12 years now. Those concrete ways of providing help and connection can last a lifetime, even if it's just for an instant.
But even concrete ways of praying for people, or are you saying you're going to pray for somebody? How are you going to do that? I remember I used to own a business where I would take people from the Daytona Beach area down to Fort Lauderdale, and they'd get on a cruise ship, and then I'd go back a week later and pick them up. And every time people would say, oh, drive safely. And I said, no, I'd rather you pray that everybody else stays away from me. I know how to drive.
Yeah.
And it sounds trite, but often we say, well, we'll pray for you. But when you tell me that you're going to pray for me, what do you really mean?
Yeah.
Or what do I really mean? And I think that we need to have a concreteness in that, and just say, I'll pray for that God will give you peace, even though you're having pain right now, or I will pray for that you'll get a good night's sleep, or, and not in a trite manner, but if God gives you the words, don't just say, you're going to pray for me.
Yeah, be more specific, be more
because then again, it's relational.
Yeah.
And then follow up and just say, how did you sleep last night?
Yeah. Absolutely.
We miss those links.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you were just talking about generosity, is what you were talking about, an unexpected generosity.
Yeah.
And the reason that you remember that 11 years later is because somebody did something you didn't expect, which is that they were thoughtful. They noticed what you need. They gave you even a little something extra to, help you have a nice time with your spouse or something like that. That kind of generosity goes a long way.
Yeah. And it's as if you've been reading the book, because that's habit number 8 is generosity. That's a great segue into the last one by Lynn Van Dyke. And she does a great job talking about generosity in terms of not just about money. And of course, generosity, she does say, of course, generosity has to do with money and is often equated with money. But it isn't always attached to money. Trying to find where
Nancy Graham-Agni shared 2 incredible things with me yesterday. She talked about how her congregation asks a principal of a local elementary school, what needs is that principal aware of? And then they give targeted money
Mhm.
to really help somebody with something that only someone that knows that person would even be aware that they needed. So they paid off a student loan before, the government was doing it, for somebody that was really challenged with that. And their congregation is buying medical debt, which can be purchased for pennies on the dollar. And they are forgiving the medical debt of people who live in the neighborhood of their congregation.
Wow.
I'm not quite sure how they
Yeah.
found out where those people are, but can you imagine getting a
Yeah.
letter that says the church down the street or around the corner has taken care of the, $5,000 that you owe and are paying on. And that church was able to buy that $5,000 worth of medical debt for $500 or even.
Yeah.
It's amazing how it's the church noticing a need
Mhm.
and doing
Mhm.
something that maybe is on a relatively small scale for the church that is on a big scale for an individual. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of generous love that takes some research and some time to figure out, but that makes a huge difference and that will get talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Generosity is definitely contagious, and we do see this in the gospel, and especially with the feeding of the 5,000, or you take the meager offering of the bread and the fish, and the sharing, that generosity, that generous act of that boy expands, and it is contagious throughout the entire community. Now, you could have a belief that it's more of a supernatural thing, or more of a potluck thing, that people show up and are generous. Either way, God is
Or a
showing the
combination.
generosity that expands. And I always find it funny that in John's gospel, John's version of it, he must have, I don't know what he was thinking, but every disciple then, if you notice, they picked up 12 baskets leftovers, and there just happens to be 12 disciples. So each disciple got a take-home lesson and a take-home reminder for them that God's generosity is bigger than they think. Yeah, generosity is great. I got to find the quote where she talks about it being not always being connected with money. Yeah, when one of my absolute favorite quote, when generous people give, they do not grasp control. Rather, they hope, standing on tiptoe, to see what might happen. A gift with strings is not a gift. And I'm sure we've all experienced or encountered that in some way at the church. Well, if you would do this, I'll give this much money. But just, standing on tiptoe, what might just happen. That's a good imagery for how we can look at it. Any other thoughts on generosity? Okay, well, the habits that she says are important for building generosity are regular giving, as you can imagine. Having a full-grown generosity is not about just being reactive to what happens in the world. It's not about being episodic, where you just base it on one or two things, but being generous is a lifestyle. So developing a regular giving of your time, your talent, your energy, temple, as I heard somebody say yesterday, and just the different ways that we give back to God and give back to others, and make it a communal action. Don't just give in solo. She says, make it a communal action. So it's about being a part of an enterprise, and that remembering that generosity can grow and generosity can influence more generosity. So be a part of a community action of generosity, and not just doing it by yourself. And then, of course, empathy and curiosity is her last one. I like that. It makes me think about Ted Lasso, and he quoted, I can't remember who the person he's quoting is, but he says, be curious, not judgmental. Be curious and empathy. Have empathy and curiosity. Generosity depends on the ability to truly see and truly hear. Again, listening and connecting. This requires both empathy and curiosity. It allows us to connect with that person truly, and it is something that is completely countercultural to the way we're living, especially, post-COVID or mid-COVID or whatever you want to call it. Generosity seems to be on short supply from time to time, or at least empathy does. But they're so tied together, it's hard to cut them apart. It is very countercultural at the moment. One of her other quotes is, it seems that our culture has prioritized dominating instead of serving, labeling instead of listening, rejecting instead of receiving. And these cultural practices or patterns are toxic weeds in our common life. So building habits of generosity is a countercultural act and by means of a witness to the kingdom of God in a world bent on violence. Yeah. It is a rich and thick book. Any more thoughts on the on Leanne Van Dyke on her section of generosity, or any of the other sections? All right. Well, I encourage you to go to 8habits.org and download the material, at least look at it. The booklets, there's 20 of them here in the presbytery office that I'm sure anybody can claim if they want one.
I'll be mailing you one.
She'll be mailing one to each of you. Yeah. And yeah, it's great for personal reflection, as I said, and corporate. If you're going to do it corporately, you're going to need to do some translation because it can be a bit dense, and the words can be a bit tricky. My wife and I was going through the presentation with her, and she's like, well, what does that word mean? I said, I don't know. So we had to go look it up together, 2 seminary grads. So be sure to know that you can't just hand it off you may not be able to just hand it off to somebody. But it is a very wonderful resource. And I hope this gives some good insight into how evangelism is more than just saving souls. It's about developing that love of Christ within us that then just boils over and spills out. Luther equated it to a water fountain, the love of God flowing into us and then flowing out of us, that we just can't stop it. That's what it's made for. And the fountain is made to shed water, and we are made to shed Christ's love as it comes into us and then goes through us. So I hope this can aid in your ministry. I hope you maybe heard something new, or at least in a new way. And thank you for joining us and for being a part of this today. I appreciate it.